Shane Hannon, a very good morning to you. How are you getting on?
Good morning, guys. How are things?
Yeah, very well. We didn't really touch on the Formula One at all over the last couple of days. It was a busy sports weekend. We are in the middle of Baku and Canada week. So give us a top line from Baku, first of all.
Yeah, top line from Baku. It's hard to believe, actually, we're just over 1/3 of the way through the season now. So it's kind of flown by the first 8 races, it has to be said. But yeah, a lot of excitement in Baku. And I guess the top line is Max Verstappen. A familiar top line. We're used to him being kind of that side of the grid. But he had a very, very good day all around. Like when you think about the leaderboard after, I think it was Australia, after race 3, like Charles Leclerc had such a commanding lead over the rest of the field, and you're starting to think this is Ferrari's year. Leclerc is doing well. Carlos Sainz is an excellent number 2 driver for Ferrari as well. Like he was 46 points ahead, was Charles Leclerc over Verstappen after that Australian Grand Prix. He's now slipped to 34 points adrift of Max. So that's an average loss of 16 points per race since that Australian Grand Prix. So all of a sudden, you just kind of see how quickly Formula One can turn on its head and the lead can slip to someone else. But yeah, I mean, Max had a fairly good weekend. His pace was so strong, in fact, in Baku at the weekend on Sunday, guys, that the team radio were basically telling him to slow down and decrease his pace to kind of save wear and tear in the car and on the tyres as well. He did oblige and he did slow down, but his lead still increased over his teammate Sergio Perez to eventually win the race by more than 20 seconds. So kind of shows how dominant he is. He's now won 5 of the 8 races so far this season. And if we're being honest, as much as we want a drivers' championship battle like we had last year, he looks the far superior driver at the minute in the far superior car.
Yeah, like that's the thing. Is there a sense that maybe at the start of the season, the Ferrari brand was kind of front and centre, and people were like, right, we're harking back to the great old days of Formula One here, where they will be contending, and absolutely there's every chance that Leclerc will be in the winner's enclosure at the end of this whole season. Was there a little bit of that, Shane, and maybe people didn't realise just how much Red Bull had to get their act together and how quickly they were capable of doing that?
Yeah, I guess there was a little bit of that. There was a little bit of the nostalgia, the seeing the red livery on the car, the prancing horse. Everyone got a bit excited seeing a Ferrari car all of a sudden back competing again for races and for, you would hope, championships as well, to make it a little bit more interesting. But and that's not to say that Red Bull haven't had their issues. Like Max hasn't been too happy with some of the oversteering on his car, which has kind of taken some of the pace away from him. But and then he's had that battle with Sergio Perez, which you can turn into a positive or a negative. They had issues in Spain that Connor sketches so effortlessly turned into a meme where Perez basically has to let Max through, and doesn't like doing that. They are teammates at the end of the day, but that's the joy of Formula One, that they're also number one rivals. That the guy you're in the same car as is the person you want to impress against the most. But the Ferrari thing is fascinating, because as I said, that start to the season, you're thinking, yeah, this is Charles Leclerc's year. The thing I'd be worried about, guys, with them and with Charles Leclerc particularly, he's at 6 poles. So of the 6 or the 8 races this year, he's been on pole position after qualifying 6 times. He's only converted 2 of those into wins. So seems to be an excellent driver on the Saturday in qualifying, and then whatever happens on the Sunday, it just goes to pot, really, as soon as the race happens. Whether it's Red Bull's race strategy, whether it's these Ferrari power unit and engine problems that seem to have kicked in, it's hard to know what the issue is. Like, you look at Baku at the weekend, and Leclerc retiring from the race after 20 laps, a power unit related issue. Carlos Sainz in the same car had to retire 11 laps earlier, and that seemed to be a hydraulics issue in the car. But it's not just those Ferrari cars. Ferrari also work on the engines and provide the engines for some other teams. Kevin Magnussen's Haas being one of them, which suffered an engine-related issue on Sunday as well. And then the Alfa Romeo of Zhou Guanyu also had issues on Sunday. And again, that's a Ferrari-provided engine. So all of a sudden, you're looking at the power units of Ferrari and thinking, something's not quite right there.
Couple of comments to put to you, Shane. Ricky Lowe says Max opted for a race setup instead of a qualifying setup. Looking back at it now, it was a brilliant plan. And then John Claffey kind of touches on a theme that's definitely been spoken about over the last little while. He says, it's such a Formula One thing to do after such a brilliant year last year. They changed the rules for the cars, and now Max is going to run away with it. There won't be a championship for the last 8 races. Is that on the money, or are we kind of maybe overlooking maybe the way Mercedes have shot themselves in the foot a little bit themselves this season, or can they just blame that on the new setup and the new regulations this year?
Like, to an extent, they can certainly blame the regulations, but and you look at, when things are going wrong, it's very easy to look at the regulation changes and say, okay, yeah, that's not really gone our way. Like, some of the great quotes from Christian Horner, even after the weekend, he's talking about the fact that Mercedes are complaining about these porpoising issues on the car. Other teams maybe aren't complaining as much. Certainly Red Bull aren't complaining as much because they're clearly dealing with it. But certainly you have to look at the real regulation changes. Like, they have a difficult job, the FIA, every year. The issues with the final race last year, and Lewis and Max's battle, and what should and should not have been done in letting Max pass the cars in front of him. Like they really can't win, the FIA. But yeah, certainly the rule changes this year seem to have gone in the favour of Red Bull, and for the early part of the season, Ferrari clearly, and their power unit was something that was actually working quite well. That's the funny thing now, because Red Bull were asked about these stricken Ferrari cars after the race on Sunday, and Verstappen emphasised with Charles Leclerc and said, look, he had a similar pattern of engine problems in the first 3 races of the season, but his quote was, shit happens, that's racing. So he didn't have a magnitude of sympathy for his Ferrari teammate or his Ferrari colleagues, as you would imagine. So yeah, look, the commenters are quite right. The rule changes have certainly gone in some particular teams' favours, but as we've seen with the swing since race 3 to the leaderboard now, anything can happen. So it's not all over yet.
Yeah, I had seen that Red Bull, they were suspicious about Mercedes, that they're making a bigger issue out of it. And Lewis Hamilton, he actually looked to be struggling to get out of his car at the end of the race.
Like, that is, and actually that's a fair point, because to see a Formula One driver getting out of the car in the way in which, like, Lewis Hamilton is a man who loves a little bit of drama potentially anyway, but it's hard not to feel sympathy for him when you see him getting out of the car like an old man after the race in Baku. And like, a lot of kind of Formula One fans laughing online saying, oh, look at the head of him getting out of that car. But it's a serious issue, because this porpoising, I mean, you talk about the dangers of mini concussions in sports like the NFL. Like, Pierre Gasly, I think, was talking about the fact that he's concerned about these drivers having to use walking sticks by the time they're in their early to mid 30s because of these issues. And this porpoising issue, for anyone who isn't familiar, it's essentially aerodynamic issues that sees these cars bounce at the high speeds. So a lot of people will have seen it on the straights. You kind of have those wonderful slow-mo videos online during the races and during qualifying where you can quite clearly see the cars bouncing. And you're dead right, Ashton. Like, Mercedes have been the team that have quite clearly struggled with that the most. George Russell is part of the Grand Prix drivers directorate as well, and he's talked about it from a safety perspective. He's actually been one of the most vocal voices talking about how dangerous it is. And really, when you see people like Lewis Hamilton struggling, and look, it has been getting worse. Like Toto Wolff, I'm just seeing a quote here in front of me from Toto Wolff after the race on Sunday, and he's saying Lewis is really bad. You can see this is not muscular anymore. It goes properly into the spine, and it can have some consequence. The solution could be to have someone in reserve, which we anyway have at every race. He was talking about Lewis Hamilton potentially not taking part in the Canadian Grand Prix in Montreal. That's how bad his back problems were, and having drivers ready to go, and Stoffel Van Dorn, I think, and Nick de Vries are their 2 reserve drivers. But yeah, this porpoising issue seemed to bleed into the rest of the drivers' grid after Sunday. So clearly it's an issue that's not going away.
And why, if for people that don't know, why is it worse for some cars than others? Like, if some cars just getting it right?
Yeah, well, this is the thing. And this is why some teams and team principals maybe don't have sympathy for Mercedes. So this effort to get porpoising brought out of the sport, there's a certain level at which cars can be off the road in terms of the chassis touching the track underneath. Mercedes is quite low, even in comparison to Red Bull. So they're essentially sacrificing a little. They could bring the car a little bit higher which would make the porpoising a little less dramatic, but that would sacrifice team performance. Now, this is what Christian Horner is saying. He's saying Mercedes can't really complain because when they are capable of lifting the car even ever so slightly and making it a little bit safer for their drivers, then they can't really complain. Like he's talking about these calls for a rule change for Mercedes and saying they're only causing a scene because their car has been so troublesome. He's saying the easiest thing is to raise a car. He was talking about you should never run a car that's unsafe, and he says that's more for the FIA's technical guys. There are certain cars that have more serious issues, Mercedes being two of them, and he thinks it's unfair to penalise the cars that have done a decent job with these porpoising regulations versus the ones that have maybe missed the target. And he's talking about Mercedes there. But if you look at it, like Daniel Ricciardo is another driver who had these issues on at the weekend, and he was talking about the general health. He said he never really understood all the drama behind Mercedes' complaints about porpoising in the previous few races. But after Sunday, you saw Daniel Ricciardo bouncing around in his McLaren car as well. He says it's got worse and worse, and he sympathises now with everyone. He said after the race he felt rattled. Not good for our general health and well-being was another quote that stood out. And he was quite clearly shaken. He spoke at one point about feeling like someone who'd been dribbled down a court by Steph Curry. And clearly these guys' heads are getting shaken. So you have some sympathy for Mercedes, but maybe they have to try raising the car, as Christian Horner said, before really regulation changes come into effect.
He would say that, and he would love that. He would love nothing more than for Mercedes to just get a little bit slower, right? And this is a really interesting sort of dilemma that these teams are in, that Mercedes and McLaren are both in. That do you sacrifice speed for the sake of driver welfare? Like, Lewis Hamilton doesn't strike me as the type of guy who's going to over-egg the back pain. He's like one of the best competitors in the sport's history. I mean, hiding pain is something that a lot of competitors do. This is obviously a pretty bad scenario that he's in, same with Ricciardo. And the teams have the power, Shane, to stop this immediately, but it would obviously mean sacrificing their capabilities of going out and trying to stop Red Bull this weekend.
100%. And like you also need to point out the fact that at the end of the day on Sunday in Baku in Azerbaijan, like George Russell finished in third, so he got a podium. Lewis Hamilton finished fourth, and that's not been a result that he's been kind of capable of getting so far this year. So the fact that they were third and fourth on the grid at the end of the race, and still having all these issues, highlights that they still have a little bit of speed. Certainly not the speed of Red Bull, and when the Ferrari cars' engines managed to finish the race, certainly not as fast as them either. But they can't really complain. Like, apparently the drivers by the end of this weekend, in those drivers debrief meetings, 19 of the 20 drivers were reportedly on board with having these regulation changes, and that could mean anything really. That's down to the technical engineers in order to kind of change the cars to address this porpoising issue. But Fernando Alonso appears to be the only exception,
right?
In terms of drivers.
Well, I was going to ask, like, who do we know who the guy is? Why does he not support his comrades?
Well, it doesn't really make sense, and I'm not quite sure why.
He's an old man as well. He's got the worst back of the lot, surely.
This is the thing. He's the old man. He's the grandfather of the grid, so you'd imagine he would have the biggest issues. Maybe perhaps he's thinking the damage is already done to me. Been there, done
exactly
that, had a long career. So it could be it. But like, when you see him not complaining about the issues and saying, it's grand, let's not change the regulations right now. But then his Alpine teammate, Esteban Ocon, is one of the other 19 drivers who is complaining, and he's in the same car as Fernando Alonso. So, like, it probably does need to change when you have 19 out of 20 drivers. Maybe they're waiting until they get the 20 out of 20 and they have the full support of the drivers' grid before they change. But I feel like something has to change. As soon as drivers start talking about driver safety, and Lewis Hamilton was making the point as well, guys, that he's traveling down a straight at ridiculous speeds. You're touching 200 miles per hour and at points. If he manages he was struggling at that point to keep the car on the grid. The porpoising and bouncing was so bad that at that speed he could quite easily have gone off and crashed into a pit wall, crashed into the side walls, and that would have been dangerous. And as soon as drivers start mentioning safety, and Daniel Ricciardo was another that did it, I guess the FIA have to stand up and take notice. So Christian Horner can laugh at Mercedes all he wants, and of course he wants their pace to go slower. But
his drivers, like, obviously his drivers want change, but Christian Horner doesn't want change. Is that what we're seeing here?
Yeah, and it's a little bit of politics as well. Like I think Horner is of the opinion that it's easy for Mercedes to complain, but he, he's always going to disagree with what Toto Wolff says. Like anyone who's watched Drive to Survive knows that Horner and Wolff probably legitimately and genuinely don't see eye to eye as human beings. Pretend to get on in the press conferences and that sort of thing, and there is that little bit of faux outrage and battles that go back and forth. But ultimately, I think even Max and Sergio Perez, the two Red Bull drivers under Horner, know that something probably needs to change. Like Max is good friends with Daniel Ricciardo. Believe it or not, he has a fairly decent working relationship, it seems, with Lewis Hamilton as well, despite all that went on last year. So these drivers talk, on the grid, off the track. So it probably feels like the rule changes are going to come into effect, but whether or not they'll bring them in soon remains to be seen, because of course Mercedes wanted to happen. Red Bull are quite happy as things go to continue on the way things are going, but you'd imagine something in the next number of weeks will come to a head with this porpoising, and as it affects, it's going to take a big crash. It's going to take this bouncing causing some serious issue, or a driver being quite visibly concussed in a post-race interview or something, I think, in order to change it.
And
really.
it shouldn't get to that stage. That's crazy. Like, it's so dangerous. And all the other factors that go along with it, like the heat that there was there at the weekend, all of those things must play a factor when you're in the car. Like, your mind, everything like that in the heat. Then if you have this on top of it, the speed you're going, like, surely something needs to be done before it gets to that stage and there is a bad accident.
100%. And listening to Lewis afterwards talking about, he was just on the straight holding and biting down in his teeth due to the pain. That's how he described it. He said the only thing that really helped was the adrenaline, and you can imagine at those speeds adrenaline would get rid of a certain amount of the pain for you at that particular moment. But he found it almost difficult to express the levels of pain that he was experiencing in the car. He was saying at the end of the straight, you just are praying for it to end. But then he goes on to say, look, still a good result for the team, third and fourth. But as you said, actually, visibly distressed getting out of the car. He said it was the most painful race of his life, and he's had plenty of them. So, look, a growing number of drivers in support of these rule changes in some way to banish the bouncing. But yeah, when you hear drivers talking about having to bite down in their teeth to stop the pain on a straight, that's extremely concerning.
Yeah, so maybe a lack of a competitive head-to-head so far in this year's Formula 1 season, but that is a significant enough storyline, and that's one to keep an eye on over the next little while. So, Canadian Grand Prix this weekend in Montreal. Thanks a million for explaining that, Shane. Just before we let you go, tonight in Poland, it is Ireland against Ukraine in the final match of this international window. The 7:45 kickoff. James McClean was in front of the media yesterday and talked about his home gym as a sanctuary for him to, I guess, keep up to speed in his own fitness work, to get fitter, to get faster. Stephen Kenny was saying that he's actually added a yard of pace, he reckons, over the last little while. And it really feels that the stocks in James McClean have risen significantly over the last little while. I don't think it's been too long ago that people mostly wanted him out of the team or thought he wasn't good enough for Ireland. Are you a fully paid up member to the James McClean fan club?
Oh, I'm one of the biggest members of the James McClean fan club. I love him. I think, like, his attitude has always been quite admirable. Like, he's of an age now where he's clearly one of the more experienced members of that Irish squad. And to hear him talking like that in the press conference, even himself and Stephen Kenny were clearly in good form yesterday, laughing about. I think Gavin Cooney at the press conference asked, did James's presence at the press conference mean he was going to be captaining Ireland in this game tonight in Rouge? But James joking, like, I think the chef would probably be made captain before me. But of course he was joking. But he's only, as he said, 7 caps off 100. And to become a centurion for your country would be quite an achievement for James. Like, he offered, I think you both agree, he offered a lot more than Enda Stevens did in that left wing back position against Scotland. He just looks more dangerous. He gets more crosses into the box. Maybe you could argue that Stevens was unlucky in that he was taking on a Ukraine team, whereas the Scottish team probably plays a different way, allowed Ireland to get more crosses into the box. But James McClean adds so much to that Ireland setup. And when you have the talent of Obafemi and Parrott, obviously Obafemi looks like likely to not make the action tonight with injury. But when you have that talent in the box, you need to get the ball into the box. And McClean, for all his, for all that some people think he doesn't bring a lot to the Irish setup, when he can get the ball into the box like that, he creates chances. So, fully paid up member of the James McClean fan club right here.
Yeah, absolutely. And the show goes, as you say, to Woods tonight for that 7:45 kick-off. Sheahan, thanks a million for being with us. Appreciate it.
Cheers, guys. Good stuff.